Hello, everybody. This is Warren Thornton for Frontline News with Lee Dawson as your military correspondent. It is time to bring this all to a crashing head, and it is very, very close to that moment. At this moment in time, we have over 50,000 NATO troops stationed in places like Poland and the Czech Republic. We have people like Duda, who are the Polish president, desperately wanting to go in when you listen to his rhetoric. And then, of course, we have the decisions of NATO and the US. Now, they're in between a rock and a hard place, are NATO, because this is not Belgrade, where you can just go and carpet bomb civilians, TV stations, and Chinese embassies, killing indiscriminately. This is not Syria, where you can just go in and carpet bomb people. And this is not chasing people around in the desert who have no air defense cover and have no air force or navy to speak of. The Russians, make no mistake, are a first class army with first class and better equipment, and they are able to produce more of it, and they are able to outlast in terms of men they can commit to this battle. And that has to be a worry because NATO are now in a fight with a first class army, and they're not used to this. Also, they can't produce the equipment in great enough numbers. And we've all seen what have happened to the Bradleys and especially the Leopards that have turned up on the battlefield. In fact, Russian artillery units actually had a competition to see who could make a Leopard's turret fly the highest. Yes, they were that ineffective. Um, the other thing that we also have to look at when it comes to NATO is they have to have a reason to go into Ukraine, and they're busy trying to organise one on the Polish border with Wagner and the Belarusian people so that they can get a reason to go in. Because if they go in without a reason, then bodies are going to start washing up. And you really, really need to believe me when I tell you that bodies will start washing up on the shores of Great Britain, Germany, Spain, Italy, France, and Germany. The people that will die in this conflict will be a lot more than you've ever seen. To put it in perspective, my sources, which are independent, say that around these are people who actually repatriate the bodies, so they know what they're talking about. They've been at this many, many years in many, many conflicts. So that around 120,000 Ukrainians have died on the battlefield in Bakhmut. Now, just to put that into perspective, that's 1.5 times the total amount of people in the British Army. Okay, so we're talking about huge numbers that will start dying on the battlefield. And because we just see it from a distance, we're inured to it, or we are in some way shielded from this. Well, we won't be when the bodies start washing up, and NATO know that. So they have to have a good reason to go in, because if they go in and people start dying, there's already a massive mainstream media narrative to support Ukraine. But most of the general population, those that are wide awake, know full well that this is a war that is being waged by ethnic cleansers and NATO, who have pushed the boundaries and pushed Russia so hard that the Russians have finally retaliated when left nowhere else to go. The Minsk agreements were broken. Ukraine wouldn't even sign them. And even Angela Merkel turned around and said, we only did that agreement to allow time for Ukraine to be armed. So there's not a lot of chance for peace here unless you give the Russians exactly what they want, because we've lied to them over and over and over again, and they do not trust us. Turkey cannot now arrange a peace because after what happened with the grain deal, they're not going to trust Erdogan either. So it's down to the US, and are the US going to commit forces in great numbers? No, they're not. They're going to get Europe to do it because they don't care if Europe is economically destroyed, which it's well on the way to be, and they don't care if the people of Europe die either. It is a real, real bad situation brought about by the coup in 2014, which was organised by the US under Victoria Nuland and the National Endowment for Democracy. Now we have an even bigger problem in that where NATO are concerned, is they cannot now stand by because there is a major problem. We all know that 120,000 people roughly died in Bakhmut. Kupiansk is a slightly smaller town than Bakhmut, but it's about to suffer the same fate. And over time, over the next few months, the Russians, who have timed it perfectly, have waited and let the Ukrainians waste lives and waste equipment trying to break down in the southern region, while in the north they've just been waiting and waiting, and finally they've pounced. And now they are encircling, in the process of encircling Kupiansk. Now, Kupiansk is a place in the north which isn't far from the road to Kharkiv, and this is something that the Ukrainians cannot lose. It will be a PR disaster for the West, NATO, and everybody else involved if they lose it. Now, what we'll have, I suspect, is we have the Ukrainians already mining the roads, and there's 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers in Kupiansk alone. Now, what we will have is, as the Russians close in and get ever closer, they'll bring up the artillery, they'll hit them with drones, airstrikes, you name it, and we'll have another Bakhmut on our hands. Now, NATO and the West cannot afford to have another of these situations like Bakhmut. Bakhmut was a total disaster, which cost the lives of hundreds, with thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. And they don't believe the nonsense that was coming and the rhetoric that was coming out of there. So they were sitting ducks when you can fly drones and you can just pound away with artillery and some of the most god-awful stuff you've ever seen in your life. It is very, very easy to get lost in the rhetoric that you will lose 3 attackers to every defender. War's moved on. It's now fought with drones, missiles, and artillery and air defense systems. It is no longer men, tanks, and aircraft carriers. And we have seen how the West, with their stupid and outmoded form of warfare, have already paid for that, or the Ukrainians rather have, using their equipment with the Leopards and the Bradleys and the Challengers not even turning up on the battlefield. So frightened are we in Britain that they will get smashed to smithereens and destroy their market value. So we have Kupiansk, which will turn into another Bakhmut and another bloodbath, which will turn into like a second Stalingrad, unless NATO do something. So it is time for NATO to finally show that they are the biggest swinging dick in the park, or they're going to slink off and nobody will ever trust them again. There is no point to NATO, and there never was once the Berlin Wall came down, unless you were using it as an aggressive force to push ever eastwards, which they did. And when the Warsaw Pact was finished, if Russia were no longer a threat, then NATO, which was put in force to make sure that the Russians weren't a threat, if Russia were no longer a threat, then there was no more need for NATO. And if NATO don't act, and if they do and they start killing Russian soldiers, then this war is going to escalate very, very quickly. If they do that, then NATO are going to be harangued for bringing dead people back to our shores. And if they don't, they're going to be damned forever as a completely useless organisation. So NATO are in between a rock and a hard place, and they have to decide whether or not they're going to put up or shut up. Thank you for listening.